So we want to welcome everybody. Come on in. We want to welcome all of our community partners as we gather together. We celebrate what is a beautiful Jewish tradition. Tonight we're here for this positive, wonderful, and meaningful experience which we hope will enlighten everybody's lives. The Tikkun Leil Shavuot is a late evening that recognizes the experience at Sinai, for which we come together with an opportunity to study with all of the amazing clergy here in Houston. A special thank you to Barbara Lozer, who put this evening together on our behalf. She's waved her usual magic wand to assure our success. A thank you to Melissa Magenheim for coordinating all of the logistics, and to Shelley Rappaport for the Blintz break, which we will share together a little later. I love the word Gazumbai. That's the person who handles our Zoom, our Gazumbai Blake Kaiser. You're welcome to steal the word. To David Scott and to the Beth Israel team for handling the marketing for tonight's program. And a thank you to all the rabbis, the cantors, and the educators for their openness to creating what is a sacred shared moment together, and for their willingness to illuminate each of us this evening with their learning and their wisdom. And I pray that it's God's will that we come together in joy many times in the future to advance Jewish living here in Houston. So each of you has, there should be available, if you haven't on your way in, there's a packet. So the life of clergy is crazy, and so we put together this packet of resources for those who had the chance to give it to us in advance. All right, if you did, don't worry about it. I don't have resources in here, so I feel comfortable in sharing that. All right, so we're going to begin this evening. At the beginning as well, there's a schedule. Rabbi David Lyon, who is the senior rabbi at Beth Israel. Commandments, how do we hear the commander? Rabbi.
Thank you, Cantor. Wonderful to see all of you. I think I'm going to put this down. You're a little taller than I am, and I'm not planning on growing tonight. Very happy to be here, and given the 18 minutes, I have to dispense with hellos and how are you, because we have to rush right through. But I will only echo Cantor Levine by saying what a real sacred commitment that our Houston Jewish community makes to each other. Not to be separated on a sacred holiday, the festival holiday of Shavuot, but rather to come together. It's not done in every major city. I think Houston is unique in how blessed we are to be together tonight. Before we begin to study, I guess I'm leading off, let's begin with a blessing. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And my teaching was not in the packet. It's being handed out now by David Scott, and we'll begin because I can't hesitate. But the text will be familiar to you, I hope, and I'll share all of them openly with you. So the title of my talk is Commandments, How Do We Respond to Their Commander? So let's begin with an examination of how we respond to being commanded to do a mitzvah. And by definition, a mitzvah isn't just a good deed, although they all are. It's a commandment. It's not even a suggestion, as some have suggested. In the 20th century, 3 Reform rabbis took up the task of answering the question, what is a mitzvah and how do we respond to the commandment? Now, the reason the question is so important tonight and before Shavuot begins is because when the Israelites stood at Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments, to receive the laws there, they said in one voice, as Torah tells us, Na'aseh v'nishma. The translation often says, we will faithfully do all that you have commanded, which is a terrible translation. We appreciate their faithfulness, but the words really say, Na'aseh, we will do, v'nishma, and then we will come to understand them. It's quite a commitment. But that's not how we've received it, because we've been raised in a much more Western, modern civilization where we don't do anything until we've come to understand it. So first we want to know why and how and what does it mean, and then we'll do it. And many of us were raised in cheder or religious school or Hebrew school, we were told by the rabbi or the cantor or the other teacher, do it. And if we asked the question, they said, just do it. It's a mitzvah. Do the mitzvah. And we were raised to understand, how do I respond to this commandment? So it was in the middle of the 20th century that three Reform rabbis in particular, among others, responded to that very needy question. How do we choose to respond as modern, progressive Jews in a world where we have many choices to do what we want? So Rabbi David Polish of blessed memory, who led Beth at the Free Synagogue in Evanston, Illinois for many years, found meaning in mitzvah through the history and shared experiences of the Jewish people. He put it this way: when Jews perform a mitzvah to remind themselves of one of those historical moments of encounter, what was only an episode long ago becomes epical. That is, what was only a moment in Jewish history becomes eternal in Jewish life. For example, in the singular moment of the ritual lighting of the Sabbath candles, we're suddenly connected with Jews everywhere in the world who light Sabbath candles too, from episode to epical. Imagine now your own mother or grandmother lighting the candles in their homes. Did she also close her eyes or bring the Sabbath spirit into her heart as she prayed for the family and recited the blessings? As you light the candles now, it connects you to all of those who are doing it at the same time around the world, but also through history into the past, to your mother, your grandmother, and perhaps even to Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel. For Polish, the source of the mitzvah flows not only from a single commanding voice, but also from the sheer power and enormity of history, which persists in the ways we continue to do what we do. He taught, we are called upon to be in the physical world. Mitzvot enable us momentarily to transcend the physical world and strengthen to return to it as we must. So the texts are in front of you, and you can refer to them later. The next one, moving right along, is Polish's rabbinic peer, Rabbi Herman Schalman. Perhaps you know his name of blessed memory. He served Emanu on Sheridan Road in Chicago for many years. Rabbi Herman Schalman understood mitzvah another way. He taught that if there's a mitzvah, a commandment, then there's a mitzaveh, there's a commander, and the commander is God. Therefore, he explained, it all depends on whether we are ready to live our lives in relationship to God, in response to God, in our acceptance of God's being commander and of we, God's covenant partner. He concluded, the number of mitzvot I choose to do is not nearly as important as is the fullness of my awareness and intention, for it is likely that in time I may hear the authentic voice of God in many more mitzvahs than at first I could have imagined. His outlook begins for us as we imagine raising our own Jewish children, or for educators in religious schools or day schools, how we invest our children in the process of appreciating the power of mitzvah and in the accumulation of doing them. Our children learn a song very early on. I know the rabbis are already tapping their toes, and Rabbi Gross is already imagining the chords on his guitar. Mitzvah goreret mitzvah is a song we all know, and it teaches the children one mitzvah leads to another. They also learn the other part of that, aveirah goreret aveirah. One transgression or one sin leads to another too. It's a simple teaching from Mishnah, but it reflects Schalman's perspective. When we do mitzvot with fullness of heart and mind, we begin to understand the value of them and the source of them. The result is that we'll do more mitzvot than we could have ever imagined. And that's what we teach our children, and that's what we can also rekindle in each of us. Third, by contrast, the rabbinic peer, Rabbi Rollin Gittleson, taught from a naturalist perspective. Gideon doesn't deny a commander as the source of the commandment, but he made room for the commander to be a spiritual energy, essence, core, or thrust of the universe, not a discrete supernatural being. He asked the question, for a religious naturalist, who is the commander? The answer, he taught, reality itself. For the naturalist, commandments represent the difference between talking about Judaism and living it. The commandments bind Jews firmly, visibly to their people and their tradition. They speak to them imperatively because they are Jewish and want to remain so. It reminds me, and I'll tell you this brief story, of Rabbi Karf of blessed memory. He spent time with a young man, a brilliant young man, who told Rabbi Karf that he was a Jewish atheist. But he went on to explain that he, this young man, was also a community volunteer, a good son, an excellent student, and an ambitious person who wanted to make a positive difference. When he explained all this to Rabbi Karf, that his motivation was founded on living his values and obligations to the world around him, Rabbi Karf told the young man that he would not think of him as an atheist, but as a Jewish agnostic. In fact, though his belief in God was in doubt, his ability to respond to the force of reality itself, as Gideon taught, still bound this young man to his Jewish soul, to his Jewish roots. Ultimately, I can tell you that the young man accepted Rabbi Karf's observation of him, that he was, instead of a Jewish atheist, a Jewish agnostic. He was well on his way. Now, I'm going to slip in a fourth teaching as well, because the 20th century delivered much, but in the late 20th to early 21st century, there's another Reformed Jewish theologian named Eugene Borowitz of blessed memory. And Borowitz wrote a book called Renewing the Covenant, and his thesis was covenantal theology. And I think it really speaks well to us as 21st century Jews here observing an ancient holiday. How do we address ourselves and hear the commandments? How do we build the covenantal partnership with God that this holiday commemorates for us? In encapsulation, and because of time, I'll share with you really the core of his teaching. He puts it this way: when we seek God as partner in every significant act, we invest our doing and deciding with direction, hope, and worth. And where we fail, we have the possibility for repair. Now, I won't repeat it, but I'm going to unpack it for just a moment. Because when we do create and maintain a covenantal relationship with God, not just passing through the days making appropriate decisions and good choices, but investing as partner our God in every significant act, we invest our doing and deciding with direction, that is kavanah, with intention, with hopefulness for the future, that our deeds are worth something to make a positive difference in the world around us, and worth, that our action now invested with God as partner has value to ourselves and those who are touched by our deeds. Beautiful, magnificent. And where we fail, he doesn't write, if we fail. He appreciates that we are human beings who are bound to stumble and err along the way. And that is part of the human experience that we also experience with God as our covenantal partner. Therefore, where we fail, we have the possibility for repair. And that possibility for repair allows us to be incredibly human in the company of our God with whom we share a covenantal relationship. And because we are able to be repaired, we can renew and start again to invest our deciding and doing with God as partner. So now we have 3 or 4 authentic responses to the question, what is a commandment and how are we commanded? Now some of you will prefer one outlook, some will prefer another outlook. How could it be otherwise? Such diversity is more familiar to us in Judaism than anything else. But the Talmud teaches us in Brachot 1, all are the words of the living God. Because either one that we choose leads us on a path to create the relationship with God that we hope will be sustaining and nurturing for us. Therefore, we accept that though we respond to the commandments differently, we are each still responding, and that's a very good thing. Without the commandments and without the commander, in all the diverse ways we imagine them, our Judaism would fail to bind us as a people who are held to the highest standards of moral and ritual living. And so perhaps in the minute and a half that I have left, I can share with you that perhaps this is a good way to begin, to appreciate that in all the diverse paths we have, it is not to ask, will I create a covenantal relationship? Will I respond to the commandment? Because the answer to that question could be no. And as Jews, as choosing Jews, that's an unacceptable answer. How will I respond? How will I hear the still small voice within me and appreciate God's presence in my life is a question that we'll answer in a number of different ways. As children, as young adults, as older adults, as mature and senior adults too, we are permitted to change our relationship and orientation to God, even as these theologians have suggested. So the choice is yours, but choose well and choose often. So thank you very much. Chag Sameach to each of you.
So the schedule as it's built allows for a couple minutes between, because we know the nature of sitting too long, of nature's call, and so there's a couple minute break in between. So let me share with you a few structural announcements. Number one, at 7:30, we'll have a pullout for the young professionals in the community. That will be held in the chapel, and for those, it's a self-defining experience. If you find yourself, if you're 100 years old and want to define yourself as a young professional, kol hakavod, enjoy. All right. During the next hour and a half, we'll also have babysitting for those available. The young professionals will have their own specific blintz break. And at that point at 9 o'clock, if they wish to go home, they may. If they want to come back in, they're certainly welcome to do so, but that opportunity is there. And so, and if there are any young professionals who wish to, at 7:30, there is a chance to go into the chapel. All right, so I'm up next. Rabbi, I apologize. I do need the stand. As I've gotten older, the words have gotten smaller. So I want to talk to you a little bit. I'm a little bit tongue-in-cheek. I love Jewish history, and so that's what I'm going to bring here. And I want to talk about coffee. First of all, a couple interesting insights. So what do you call sad coffee? Depresso. How are coffee beans like children? They're always getting grounded. And what is it that you call when you steal someone's coffee? It's called a mugging. So I may not be a dad, but I think I've mastered the dad joke. The development of ritual, Jewish ritual and practice, has often derived from transcendent experiences, but there are also numerous times in history where religious traditions emerge as the result of or are shaped by social factors. Historian Elliot Horowitz labeled such experiences as the social history of piety. A commonplace example, I think you'll all recognize right away, is the expanded way in which we celebrate Hanukkah in America. It is a minor, non-biblical holiday which has assumed a central place in modern Jewish identity due to its proximal relationship with Christmas. Sometimes, however, the shifts are far more subtle, but they're nonetheless significant in terms of how Jewish life is shaped. I offer for your consideration the coffee bean. Coffee, grown worldwide, can trace its heritage back centuries to the ancient coffee forests of the Ethiopian plateau. There's a famous legend. It says that the goat herder Kaldi first discovered the potential of these beloved beans. The story goes as follows. Kaldi discovered coffee after he noticed that following eating these seeming berries from a tree, his goats became so energetic that they did not want to sleep at night. Kaldi reports his findings to the local abbot in the local monastery, and he makes a drink with the berries and finds that it keeps him alert through the long hours of evening prayer. The abbot, therefore, shares his discovery with the other monks, and knowledge of the energizing berries begins to spread. As word moves east and coffee reaches the Arabian Peninsula, it begins a journey which would bring those beans across the globe. European travelers to the Near East brought back these stories of this unusual dark black beverage. By the 17th century, coffee had made its way to Europe and was becoming popular across the continent. Some people, however, reacted to this new beverage with suspicion and fear, calling it the bitter invention of Satan. The local clergy condemned coffee when it first came to Venice in 1615. And the controversy was so great that Pope Clement VIII was asked to intervene. And he decided, like any wise person, I'll taste it. So he tasted the beverage for himself, and he found it so satisfying that he gave it papal approval. Starbucks remains in his debt. Despite any controversy, coffee houses were quickly becoming the center of social activity and communication in England, Austria, France, Germany, and Holland. In England, penny universities sprang up, so-called because the price of a penny could purchase a cup of coffee, and you had the opportunity to learn and engage in stimulating conversation. Coffee began to replace the common breakfast beverages, listen to this, wine and beer. Good morning. Those who drank coffee instead of alcohol began the day, not surprisingly, alert and energized, and the quality of their work was greatly enhanced. You can think of this as sort of the precursor to the office coffee room. Composer Johann Sebastian Bach composed the secular coffee cantata, a musical ensemble conducted at the local cafe in which a young woman pleads with her disapproving father to accept her devotion to drinking coffee, which was a newfangled fashion. The libretto includes such lines, and again, it's translated from the German, so it doesn't necessarily flow as nicely as we'd like. Oh, how sweet coffee does taste, better than 1,000 kisses, milder than muscat wine. Coffee, coffee, I've got to have it. And if someone wants to perk me up, oh, just give me a cup of coffee. In the mid-1600s, coffee was brought to New Amsterdam by the British. And though coffee houses rapidly began to appear, tea continued to be the favored drink in the New World until 1773, when the colonists revolted against the heavy tax that was placed upon them by King George. The revolt, as well you know, is known as the Boston Tea Party, and it would forever, ever change the American drinking preference to coffee. By the time of Thomas Jefferson, he says, coffee is described as the favorite drink of the civilized world. The introduction and the spread of coffee introduced far-reaching changes into both individual habits and social norms, as well as the spread of Jewish rites involving nocturnal wakefulness. Wherever coffee spread, It extended the ranges for making use of the night hours for whatever purposes, whether they be pious or profane. The history of numerous Jewish customs and perhaps even ideas may be linked to coffee and coffee houses in such cities as Sfat or Venice, and the beverage was much discussed in the responsa literature. Ultimately, if you look in the Jewish Encyclopedia, which was printed at the turn of the last century, you'll even find an article of coffee in there. And so this evening, what I want to do is explore the role of coffee in generating and popularizing new forms of nightlife within Jewish society. By the 18th century, the attraction of drinking coffee by Jews was so great that rabbis were already concerned about actual or potential violations of Jewish law resulting from a deep desire to consume the stimulant. So when and where? When and where does coffee make its first appearance in Jewish history? The earliest response in which it is discussed concerns the question of its permissibility for consumption if it's prepared by someone who is not Jewish. And it was composed by the rabbis, by Rabbi David ibn Avi Zimra, a question that ultimately was answered in the affirmative. In his responsum, the rabbis praised coffee on account of the many benefits it provided, especially that of driving away sleep during the performance of nocturnal devotions. On the other hand, he also limited his advocacy of the beverage by insisting that it be kept free of the taint of the reprehensible activities associated with the coffee houses. What those were, I'll let your imagination play. Isaac Luria, a younger contemporary of the rabbis, gathered around him a circle of disciples who followed his Kabbalistic system and observed his distinctive practices. One of the practices popularized by Luria and his disciples was the regular recitation of a midnight rite mourning the temple's destruction and praying for its return. This practice, known as Tikkun Chatzot, Chatzot meaning midnight, was observed in various forms throughout the Middle Ages as an act of individual piety. Let me give you a glimpse of Sfat provided in the local tradition concerning Rabbi Abraham Halevi Bikurim, who the following, it says, every night he would rise at midnight and walk through the streets, raising his voice and shouting bitterly, "Arise in honor of the Lord, for the Shekhinah is in exile and our temple has been burnt." And he would call each scholar by his name, not departing until he saw that the scholar had left his bed. Within an hour, the city was full of the sounds of study, Mishnah and Zohar and Midrashim of the rabbis, psalms and prophets, hymns, dirges, supplicatory prayers. But it's only in the 16th century in Palestine that the Tikkun Chatzot suddenly took off and became a collective, a mass rite, spreading to other countries in the Near East and the Mediterranean basin. Its popularization was, of course, part of the wider diffusion of Kabbalistic rites during this period and their penetration into daily life. But it certainly cannot be divorced from the increasing availability by day and night of a stimulant such as coffee. Beyond the mere availability of a new stimulant, the introduction of coffee also brought with it the emergence of a new perception of the night. The hours of darkness suddenly could be shaped and manipulated by human initiative rather than just being a passive repose. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, coffee had become a complete standard part of nocturnal rituals practiced in the land of Israel. When the Italian Rabbi Moses Zaccato responded in 1673 to a question regarding the permissibility of drinking coffee before morning prayers, he expressed the opinion that only such beverages as beer or wine would be prohibited, but that water or medicinal drinks were not. And as evidence, he cited the practice that throughout the land of Israel, where it was customary to drink coffee every night after midnight, for it was similar to medicine in that it drives away sleep, as is known. Rabbi Joseph Caro, he traveled from Sfat to Turkey in 1536, and at first he showed no familiarity with this new product. His exposure to coffee resulted in the introduction of a custom of all-night study vigil on Shavuot, symbolizing the reception of Torah, a practice that we're here tonight for. The mystics had several ideas. They had the idea that at midnight, the heavens open and favorably receive the thoughts, the study, the prayers of those who would remain awake on the anniversary of the revelation. Some promoted the legend that all wishes would be fulfilled this evening at midnight. And the Moroccan Jews came to believe that staying up all night on Shavuot guaranteed life in the next year. So for me, this represents in many ways what I believe is the common development of many rituals. I'm going to sort of play off something Rabbi Lyon said. He was, today's world, you have to sell the product and then people will do the action. Okay? It's not always been the same. In many ways, what happens is the custom precedes its interpretation. And so rituals often exist before their meanings are superimposed upon them at a later point. And the following Midrash, to my mind at least, demonstrates that idea. According to the Midrash, the giving of Torah at Mount Sinai, obviously one of the most fundamental and famous moments in our history, is only as great as its preparation that leads up to it. And so the night before, according to the Midrash, the Jewish people did exactly what anybody does before an important event. They turned in early for a good night's sleep. This seemingly innocent decision, however, led, according to the Midrash, to embarrassing consequences. The next morning, when it came time for Torah to be given, the place was empty. The entire Jewish people had slept in. The Midrash recounts that Moses had to wake them, causing God later to lament, "Why have I come and nobody is here to receive me?" To the traditional mind, this story remains a shameful part of our history, and it's at the heart of the custom of staying up late tonight. They would say that the institution of a tikkun was therefore developed in order to rectify our forefathers' mistake. Perhaps instead, following the development of the practice of the tikkun, a biblical or midrashic source was sought to justify. That would probably be my suggestion. I'll allow you to contemplate the causality and which sits comfortably with you. I will nonetheless offer that it is the emergence of the coffee bean which allowed the tradition of the Tikkun, Leil, Shavuot to take hold and to be commonplace, and the enabler for us to gather here tonight. And so as we proceed through the evening, I raise my cup of coffee and say, L'chaim. All right. We have a couple minutes if anybody needs a break, and then we will invite Rabbi Gross from Houston Congregation of Reformed Judaism to join us. But just take about a 5-minute break and breathe. You have a chance to visit. We want people to get to know one another. Enjoy. Wait, I think the coffee's outside. Yeah. We're going to give you a 1-minute warning. All right, give it a shot. Any better? There's coffee in the back there. Oh, you hate it? You don't have to drink coffee. It's tea still works. All right, my friends. Put your study caps back on. So as each presenter comes up, you can make a decision on this lovely little device. We're going to continue now. Rabbi Steve Gross, as I said, from Houston Congregation of Reformed Judaism. What took place as revelation was occurring?
Thank you. Well, this is pretty high. I'm going to... Well, this was great. And Cantor's presentation on coffee is great. My favorite coffee, if people have been to Israel, the strange fascination with instant coffee is something that just baffles me until recently I learned something, and that is the most popular instant coffee is called Nescafe, right? And the word miracle in Hebrew is nes, which is what they call it. And it's miracle coffee. They take the water, you take a scoop of this brown stuff and Nescafe. It gave me a new appreciation. It's still terrible, but. So I will be loyal to my 18 minutes. I've got a timer here. But so I'll hit that in just a second, but I want to draw your attention. I did provide, you have text in the photocopied pamphlet, and wish you all Chag Sameach. We are going to explore Revelation and what took place at the moment that Torah was revealed. And so I push start. Let's see if I can get through all these texts. We begin with what it says in the Torah. In Exodus 19, we read, "On the third day as morning dawned, there was thunder and lightning and a dense cloud upon the mountain, and a very loud blast of the horn, and the people who were at the camp trembled. Moses led the people out of the camp toward God, and they took their places at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was all in smoke, for Hashem had come down upon it in fire, and smoke rose like smoke of a kiln. And the whole mountain trembled violently. The blare of the horn grew louder and louder. As Moses spoke, God answered him in thunder." So the question was, what actually took place at Sinai? We read these words, and it's very dramatic and lots of imagery. And how was revelation to be transmitted through the generations? That's what we're going to explore today through the rabbinic imagination through Midrash. Before we look at text, I'll tell you a story of an argument that took place with many rabbis around a table. And they were debating this very fact, this very issue. What took place at Sinai? What was actually revealed from the mountain? And one rabbi raised his hand and said it was the 10 Commandments and the Torah. Everything in it, in the oral and the written, everything was revealed at that moment. And those who sat around the table nodded their heads. And another rabbi raised his hand and said, no, if God had only revealed the Torah and not the oral Torah, that would have been enough. And people nodded their heads. And then someone said, no, if God had just revealed the 10 Commandments, that would have been enough to be a revelation at Sinai. And some of them nodded their heads. And another said, no, you know what? If only the first of the 10 Commandments, Ani Adonai, I am the Lord. If that were the only commandment that was revealed at Sinai, that would have been enough. And the rabbis nodded their heads. And yet another, of course, said, no, if only the first word of the first of the 10 Commandments had been revealed at Sinai, that would have been enough. And they nodded their heads. And then one said, no, if only the first letter of the first commandment. Oh, Daddy didn't say what the word was. It was Ani. Ani was the first word in the first of the 10 Commandments. And the rabbi said, if only the first letter of Ani were revealed at Sinai, that would have been enough. And there was puzzlement on the faces of everyone, because the first letter is just an aleph, which has no sound at all. They said, no, it's not that it's silent. It invites sound. If you put an ah under aleph, it's ah. If you put a under aleph, it's a. If you put e under aleph, it's e. And then they understood that that would have been enough. It's the engagement of revelation that forms our people. It's how it unfolds over time as we engage the text and argue and apply it to our lives and apply it from generation to generation. That is what Revelation's all about, that unfolding of our engagement in Torah. Now, the rabbis over the course of time debated in many ways, and I have lots of text here to share. One is from Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, and there's a little description there for you to see where that came from. It's from the 135 CE, a Halakhic legal Midrash, on the book of Exodus. And this text was, this Midrash is on the passage which says, and Moses took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. We have not heard what Moses read to them. Rabbi Josi suggested, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, he suggested that from the beginning of Genesis up to this moment, that was what Moses read to the people in that moment. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said, he read the commandments given to Adam, the commandments given to the descendants of Noah, and the commandments given to the Israelites in Egypt and at Marah, and all the other commandments that they had already been given. And then Rabbi Yishmael said, he read them the laws about the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year and the blessings and the curses. So what does this suggest that in this rabbinic commentary? It suggests that each of these rabbis is looking at what aspect of our historical narrative was Revelation speaking to. What Moses was telling the people in that moment of revelation, what did he read? Well, the first passage from Rabbi Yossi, he was arguing that we should focus on the past, from Genesis to this point, right? This was a very populist kind of argument, that it's the formation of our identity to this point in time. And then Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said we should focus our message on the present by reading all of the commandments, how to do the right thing right now. Much of what Rabbi Lyon was talking about in the first presentation about the mitzvah and the mitzaveh, the commandment and the commander, how we live our lives in the present. And then the third interpretation of what Moses may have read to the Israelites in that moment was Rabbi Yishmael, who said we must focus on the future, the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year, which happens again and again over every 7 years and then every 49 years, that we look to the future, to the shaping of our history from this point forward, all of which are powerful and beautiful ideas. The rabbinic imagination with regards to Sinai and Revelation is discussed also here in the Talmud. In Shabbat 87b, you have the text in front of you. It says, the Torah says, and Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet God. And they stood at the lowermost part of the mountain. That was read in that passage I read from Exodus 19, verse 17. They stood at the lowermost part of the mountain. And Rabbi Avdimi Bar Hassa said, the Jewish people actually stood beneath the mountain. And the verse teaches that the Holy One, blessed be He, overturned the mountain above the Jews like a tub and said to them, if you accept the Torah, excellent. And if not, this is where you will be buried. Rabbi Achabar Yaakov said, from here there is a substantial caveat to the obligation to fulfill the Torah. The Jewish people can claim that they were coerced into accepting the Torah and that therefore it is not binding. Rava said, even so, they again accept it willingly in the time of Achashverosh, where it is written, the Jews ordained and took it upon themselves and upon their seed and upon all such as joined themselves unto them, and taught the Jews ordained what they had already taken upon themselves through the coercion at Sinai. So here's the idea that we were being threatened, either accept these commandments or I'm going to drop this mountain on you. That's a very imaginative passage, but it begs the question, what motivates us to follow these laws? What motivates us to engage in our faith? And how do we teach our children? How do we perpetuate these teachings into the future? Because if it's all coercion, if you're only not allowing your children or our members to think for themselves, then sometimes there's rebellion. We all know kids that have completely rebelled. My oldest eats lots of bacon. But my youngest is always asking, does this have milk in it? Right? So it depends on how you feel, whether you feel obligated by your faith or whether you feel like you have a mountain above you and there's tons of guilt. So we have now yet another passage from the rabbinic imagination of what may have taken place at Sinai. This is a powerful one as well. Come and see, it says, how the voice would go out among all Israel, each and every one according to his or her strength. The elders according to their strength, the young men and women according to their strength, the infants according to their strength, the sucklings according to their strength, the women according to their strength, and even Moshe according to his strength. As it is stated in Exodus 19:19, Moshe would speak and God would answer him with a voice that he could withstand. And so too, it is stated in Psalm 29:4, the voice of the Lord is in strength. It is not stated in his strength, but rather in strength, in the strength that each and every one, and even a pregnant woman, according to their strength. Hence, one would say, each and every one according to his strength. What is this telling us? That we hear revelation according to our own capacity to understand it, not unlike the 4 children that we study or learn about in our Haggadah. We hear revelation in our own voice or in our own way, that which we can do. And we try as hard as we can, according to our age, according to our strength, according to our physical abilities, to observe and live by these commandments. And finally, we have so much information being packed into this, but again, this is just how the rabbis imagined how revelation was transmitted in the moment and how we transmit it through the generations. And this one comes full circle with a little bit with what Rabbi Lyon was talking about. This says, he's playing with the text from Exodus 19:8. It says, all those assembled answered as one, saying, all that the Lord has spoken we shall do. All those assembled is the statement that Rabbi Simcha of Dvinsk was dealing with. All those assembled answered as one. No individual Jew has the ability to fulfill all of the mitzvot of the Torah. There are mitzvot given only to the priests, or only to the Levites, or only to the king, or only to the high priest, or only to an individual who owns a field, or a house, etc. Therefore, the Torah says, all those assembled answered as one, followed by, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. This is in order to indicate that only the Jewish community in its entirety can say, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. We happen to be in the sabbatical year, which is, without going into tons of detail about it, only commanded to the land of Israel. And so those Jews who observe the sabbatical of the land fulfill the mitzvah for all other Jews around the world. Just one of many types of examples of where we can divide up all of these commandments and come together as one people. As we progress through this evening of study and understanding, I pray that revelation will come to you in your own strength, in your own way, and that collectively we go from this place to change the world as Jews, as a community. And I thank you for this time. And I made it within I even had 3 minutes left. Wow. But time to enjoy a little more coffee. Thank you.
Yeah, when we put the program together conceptually, someone said to me, you're going to give rabbis and cantors microphones and expect them to finish in 18 minutes? Good luck with that. I want to point out we're ahead of schedule. Our next presenter, our next scholar, Rabbi Gideon Estes from Oren, longtime friend, and we know each other from Orange County, even before we came here to Houston. So, Rabbi Estes, if you would please, we look forward to your wisdom.
I have those who are planning to come to me for my session, so. No, I don't drink caffeine. It's water. So what I want to talk about today is the Torah of Kvetch. The author of the book Kvetch points out that Kvetch is really old in our people. It actually goes back to the Torah, and we have lots of examples of it. And I'm going to bring a few different examples of talking about it and then derive some lessons from it. One of my favorite things to do is to take lessons from things that we can learn not only from the good examples of our ancestors, but also some of their missteps. And so that's what we're going to take a look at. And we're going to see that some kvetch has value and some kvetch is a cautionary tale. We're going to start with the cautionary tale. I'm going to speak a little quickly because you might have noticed that I have lots of text. But don't worry, some of it's going to be jumped through, but I'm going to do a little bit just to give us the mood. So this is where I took my title from, and that's why I'm starting with this text. The people took to bitterly complaining before Adonai. Adonai heard and was incensed. A fire of Adonai broke out against them, ravaging the outskirts of the camp. The people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to Adonai, and the fire died down. This is a known pattern in the book of Numbers. The place was named Taberah because the fire of Adonai had broken out against them. The riffraff in the midst felt a gluttonous craving, and then the Israelites wept and said, "If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we used to eat free in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. Now our gullets are shriveled. There's nothing at all, nothing but manna to look to." Now this manna was like coriander seed in color. It was like bdellium. The people would go about, gather it, grind it between millstones, or pound it in a mortar, boil it in a pot, and make it into cakes. It tasted like rich cream. There's actually a Midrash that it tasted like whatever they wanted it to taste like. It was just amazing stuff. Like literally free bread that came from God. And like, oh, that's so terrible. When the dew fell on the camp at night, the manna would fall upon it. Moses heard the people weeping, every clan apart, at the entrance of each tent. Adonai was very angry, and Moses was distressed. And Moses said to Adonai, "Why have you dealt ill with your servant? Why have I not enjoyed your favor that you have laid this burden of all this people upon me? Did I produce all this people? Did I engender them that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a caregiver carries an infant to the land that you have promised on oath of their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give to all these people when they whine before me and say, 'Give us meat to eat'? I cannot carry all these people by myself. It is too much for me. If you deal thus with me, kill me rather, I beg you, and let me see no more of my wretchedness." I just love the over-dramaticness of like Moses, right? "Hey, God, kill me, I can't do it." No. Then Adonai said to Moses, "Gather for me 70 elders who have experience with elders of others, officers of people, bring them to the meeting, and let them take their place with you. I will come down and speak with you, and there I will draw upon the Spirit that is upon you, and put upon they shall share the burden of the people with you, and shall put not bear to look." This deals later on, which we're going to exempt some of this from the second about Eldad and Medad, but this is the key. This is one of my favorite lines of Torah. "And say to the people, purify yourselves." The Hebrew is Titkadesh. We'll come back to that with both Rashi in a second. "For tomorrow you shall eat meat. For you have kept whining before Adonai and saying, 'If only we had meat to eat. Indeed, we are better off in Egypt.' Adonai will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall eat not 1 day, not 2, not even 5 or 10 or 20, but a whole month until it comes out your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you. For you have rejected Adonai who is among you by whining before God and saying, 'Oh, why did we ever leave Egypt?' But Moses said, 'The people who are with me are 600,000 foot soldiers. Yet you say I will give them enough meat to eat for a whole month. Could enough flocks and herds be slaughtered to suffice them? Or could all the fish of the sea be gathered for them to suffice them?' And Adonai answered Moses, 'Is there a limit to Adonai's power? You shall soon see whether I have said happens to you or not.' Moses went out and reported to the words of Adonai to the people. He gathered 70 of the people. The elders stationed around them 10 clans. This is the Eldad and Medad, so we're skipping that. That's where there's ellipses. A wind from Adonai started up, swept quail from the sea, and strewed them over the camp about a day's journey on this side and about a day's journey on that side, all around their camp, some 2 cubits deep. That's like 36 inches, 3 feet of quail. Swept quail from the sea and strewed 2 cubits deep on the ground. The people set to the gathering quail all that day and night and all the next day, and even the one who gathered the least had 10 homers. It's a huge amount. And they spread them all out around the camp, and the meat was still between their teeth, not yet chewed, when the anger of Adonai blazed forth against the people, and Adonai struck the people with a very severe plague. That place was named Kirbot Hata'ava, because the people who had craving were buried there. Then the people set out for Chazarot, and when they were in Chazarot. I know I read very quickly. You can read it back more later. What's very interesting, right, is you hear this like really bitter complaint. "Oh, I want the meat. It would be better to be a slave in Egypt." Yeah, because really when you were a slave, like that's better eating. And so we have this first complaint of like God's rebuke, right? God's, "I'm going to give you," and I love that this is the example we all know from like our parents. At least I know from my mother saying, "You'll have so much it'll come out your nose." That's biblical. Like the chocolate answer of like, oh, you want chocolate? Got to eat chocolate. You give it too much, and it becomes loathsome. It's very biblical. So Rashi first kind of says to them, okay, we have this word, hitkadshu, prepare yourselves. And he's quoting the Mechilta, which is that, he's quoting the Sifrei for Bamidbar, where it says that you shall receive punishment. Simmons cites in Jeremiah, prepare them for the day of slaughter. So this is Rashi's influence about hitkadshu means punishment. Now, my next source I'm covering is a lot of Or HaChaim, and I'm going to jump through his stories. I'm not going to read everything inside. I gave you a lot of him. There's even more on these verses, but Or HaChaim, as my teacher, Dr. Walter Hertzberg, would say, gave a very psychological commentary. As he had a deep understanding of kind of the psychology going in underneath, is how he would kind of describe Or HaChaim. So Or HaChaim says, first he summarizes what Rashi did from the Sifrei, sanctify yourselves tomorrow, etc. That according to the Sifrei, our verse, the reason why God did not provide the meat until the following day was they saw in the word hikachu a warning of approach of disaster. This is how the Sifrei words. God said, prepare yourself for disaster. God wanted to issue a warning. The very fact that he granted their request for meat was some kind of his answer, and he gave them a chance to perhaps pause and repent. But they didn't. Next page. For you have wept, right? So this is something which I found interesting, right? Is that God saying, because you have wept. Normally you might think that someone crying, that's not a big deal, right? That seems very counterintuitive to God get mad at people crying, because we can have emotions, we can have feelings, we're not expected to be perfect. And this is where I love the Or HaChaim. So he comes to say, what was the problem with their cries? This reveals that God pays attention to weeping. We need to understand why he considers this very act of weeping as something ugly and detestable. Weeping may be perceived as a manifestation of someone having totally abandoned any hope of achieving certain important objectives. Rather, it's a very key reading. It's not just they're weeping, but they're weeping so much so that they had no faith of God who was in their midst. It's them kind of pissing on their opportunities, right? It's not really appreciating all the gifts they had. Because it's saying, oh, we were better in Egypt. And that type of kvetch, that's what got God. Because it was that they gave up any chance of hope. You can be worried about something, but you're not allowed to be hopeless. You're not allowed to despair completely. We have to have some faith. And that's really what got God upset. The rabbi that I interned for when I was in rabbinical school, Rabbi Dan Satlow, would always talk about what was the sin of the Miragulim, of the spies. It's not that they said that they thought that it was dangerous. Their sin was saying, we must have seen grasshoppers to them, and that's what they must have thought too. That's the sin, is they're saying what the other people thought too. You can say, I felt like a grasshopper to these giants, but saying that they think of us as grasshoppers, no, that's the sin. That's causing everyone else to despair. That cause of despair, if your kvetch is causing despair, it's not allowed. Were they not so, they should have at least asked God as much as a son asked his father for his heart desire. When one weeps instead of asking God to grant one's wish, that reflects that one's belief in God's inability to grant one's wish. The very words, mi yahu basar, who could possibly give us meat to eat, right? It's this idea of it's an impossibility. And God's like, oh really, it's an impossibility? Boom, it's not an impossibility. So this continues with, in the ears of God, Boznei Hashem, the Torah emphasizes that the Israelites spoke thus, although they had already been aware that God hears everything. Remember, God is in their midst. They have a pillar of smoke, of fire, of cloud. God's representation is very physical for them. It's not remote. It's not they have stuff that God's in their midst. They've seen the hand of God split the sea. And despite that, it's the special chutzpah, effrontery, to utter such words when God knows and hears them. When they said in verse 6 was even worse, because God quotes them, right? And let's go back to verse 6 real quick. Now our gullets are shriveled, there's nothing but this manna to look to, right? It's like you're literally getting bread made by God, and you're like, oh, it's just so terrible. And the Lord will give you meat and you will eat. So this is, I love this one, the commentators do. It seems redundant. You will eat and you will eat. So why does you will eat repeat? What Or HaChaim tells us is that it's not superfluous. Rather, it's that it's now a command. If they had kind of changed back their thing and said, oh no, we'd love meat, but don't go out of your way, But no, now he's like, no, you got to eat it. You want it? You're going to have it. And even when you're tired of it, you're still going to have it. And that's why there was so much that even the person who could like, oh, I can eat meat for days. Yeah, well, really? Eat it for a month. And that's this idea that is developed by the Orchaim of that the and you'll eat is it's a command, that they had to eat it, that it wasn't a choice anymore. And if not, they didn't do it, they were, and not one day. We must understand the reason why Torah describes the time would eat meat is, he's continuing his main point. So that's why, because if they don't eat it, then they're violating command. Now I want to go to some other kvetches. So I'm on the page where it says Exodus 14 to 11 to 18, the bottom of the page. So there we're going back in time. This is just leaving Egypt. And they said to Moses, was it for want of graves in Egypt that you brought us to die in the wilderness? What have you done for us taking us out of Egypt? Is not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us be, and we'll serve the Egyptians, for it's better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. But Moses said to the people, have no fear, stand by, and witness the deliverance of which Adonai will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see again. Adonai will battle for you and hold your peace. Then Adonai said to Moses, I love this line too, why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites, go forward. Lift up your rod, hold out your arm over the sea and split it, so that the Israelites may march in the sea on dry ground. And I will stiffen the hearts of the Egyptians, they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his warriors and his chariots and his riders, and let the Egyptians know that I am Adonai when I gain glory through Pharaoh and his chariot riders. So what I love about this is that one, we see when kvetch has reason, right? They're scared, they're slaves, they just kind of went through a very traumatic thing. No one's getting mad at them for being scared. It's okay, their kvetch is answered. It's interesting that God gives a little push to Moses of hey, you're the leader, don't come to me. There's a time when the kvetch, they're allowed to kvetch right now, but you have solutions. Help solve the problems for them. Tell them to keep going, right? Having that hope, and go do stuff. Use that magic staff you have, and then you can do it, right? We have the Midrash about Nachshon, that he went up to his neck, and then the water split. That there's this idea of we should look at when we kvetch. Sometimes there's a reason for kvetch and it's reasonable, right? When a kid kvetches because they're angry, that's acceptable. We know that we need to give them something to eat, a snack, and then they'll be fine. There's times of when it's permitted. Other times, not so much. It's about knowing this balance. And the other answer is to know we have power inside of ourselves. So now we have this other great thing, which is in 15:24, and the people grumbled against Moses, what shall we drink? So he cried out to Adonai, and I showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water became sweet. There God made for them a fixed rule that they were put to a test. So then we get some more complaints about some water. Sitting out from Elim, the whole community came. Oh, this is another about meat. So hanging out from Elim, the whole community came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. In the wilderness, the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. See, a lot of kvetching. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the hand of Adonai in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, when we ate our fill of bread, for you have brought us into this wilderness to starve this whole congregation to death. Dramatic much? And Adonai said to Moses, I will rain down bread on you from the sky, and the people shall go out and gather each day. The portion of thus I will test them, for they will say, right, this is the instructions of manna. Yada, yada, yada. For you, we shall grumble against, since it is Adonai. Moses continued, we will give you flesh to eat in the evening and bread in the morning to the full, because Adonai has heard the grumblings you utter. What is our part? Your grumbling is against Adonai, not against us. And then Moses said to Aaron, stay the whole Israelite community, advance towards Adonai, who heard your grumbling. And Aaron spoke to the Israelite community, and they turned towards the wilderness, and there the cloud appeared in the presence of Adonai, and spoke to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Speak to them and say, by evening you shall eat flesh, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread, and you shall know that I am Adonai your God. In the evening quail appeared and covered the camp. Morning there was a fall of dew about the camp, and when it fell out, dew lifted over there in the surface of the wilderness. A fine flaky substance, this is the manna. Dairy bread, exactly. And they have an omer to eat, which is good. So, what's interesting is this first time they grumbled about meat, it wasn't a huge sin. It's understandable, it's still early. This is not yet, you didn't have Sinai revelation yet. They're pre-bar mitzvah. you have a chance to kind of put up a little bit more tolerance with what they're saying. And so, but there's still like some reminders, like, hey, like you're being a little ungrateful, like we'll take care of it. We've got snack coming, don't worry. When's snack coming? When we have snack time, like it's gonna be happening. But it shows that this anguish, I think, is very interesting. Then we get in 1727, the people quarreled with Moses. Give us water to drink, they said. And Moses replied to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why don't you ask Adonai? But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses, said, why did you bring us from Egypt to kill us and kill livestock? Moses cried out to Adonai, saying, what shall I do with this people? Before long they will be stoning me. Moses is also dramatic. And then God said to Moses, pass before the people, take some of the elders, take along the rod which you struck the Nile, and set out. I'll be standing there before you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, water will issue from it, and the people will drink. Moses did so. The place was named Maaseh and Meribah, because they quarreled. And this is quoted in the Psalms that we say on Kabbalat Shabbat, because they tried Adonai and said, is Adonai present among us or not, right? Like, they were so preconceived about like wanting the water that he takes their grumble, he goes to God, God helps them, taking this staff, which they'd seen deliver death, now delivers health and water and life. Would that we have died, Rashi explains to us that they're speaking figuratively. That's what Rashi tells us about. And then we have Sforno is they did not want to die. What they had said is that if it's gone flat on Allah to die, that he should arrange for them to die because we know from Lamentations that hunger is a terrible way to die. And so they would rather like be killed all at once than die from hunger. But I want to compare this with my last link on this is the other time of when they complained about water. This is after Miriam's death. They're complaining about water again. And this time Moses turns to God. I'm just going to summarize. You can read it on your own. And, and Moses is really frustrated with them. Understandably, he just lost his sister. And he says, you want water? We'll bring water for you. God told him to speak to the rock. Moses doesn't speak to the rock. Instead, he yells at them and he bashes the rock. His answer to their kvetch is to lose his patience. And the ultimate thing is that he gets punished by God. Something that he feels was unfair, and he continues to kvetch about this through the entire book of Deuteronomy. But there's a big difference. The time in Numbers is they'd already had like the revelation. They knew that there's ways to kind of do things. And by Moses hitting the rock instead of speaking to the rock, because he lost the chance, and it was that sin of kind of giving up hope. So what I would like you to take away from this about this lesson of kvetch, kvetching sometimes is okay. Like if you're hungry and like things are crummy or happening, it's okay to kvetch a little bit. But if your kvetch manifests itself in utter desperation, there's a term in halakha of yeyush, like you've given up any chance of ever recovering something. If it causes you to like level of desperation that you're yeyush on God, that's bad kvetch. That leads to suffering. So you can kvetch, but don't lose hope. Thank you. Chag Sameach.
So for the synagogue officers who are here, I think the halakha l'maaseh that I heard is that if there's too much kvetching, throw quail. We are, as I said, a little bit ahead of schedule. Temple Emmanuel has a confirmation program tonight, which is sort of traditional to Shavuot. It's the acceptance of Torah. And so our next speaker is a little bit delayed, but that's good. It gives us a chance to breathe. We'll take another quick break. We are going to come back hopefully at about 8:35. There is coffee in the back area back here. Enjoy.
Testing. That seems good.
Do you have a pedal to change pages?
I do. I'm not very good at it.
All right, once again, about a 2-minute warning. He's very good at it. All right, please come in, find a seat. Welcome back. So note to self for next year, maybe providing food and then asking everybody to come back might be a great challenge. All right. We're going to continue in just a second. As I mentioned to you, Congregation Emmanuel had a very special program this evening, and so it took a little longer for them to be able to join us. But we're very excited to have Cantor Rollin Simmons here, who's going to take us through the next session. And we turn the floor over. It's all yours. Thank you.
Well, Chag Sameach, everyone. Ah, such good energy in this room. So, this guitar is very loud, maybe a tiny bit less. So I have this sheet for you in your packet called Songs of Torah and Learning. I hope you'll find it in there. And I wanted to share, I picked some musical selections that related to Torah and study, some of my favorites. And the first one is called Sweet as Honey. It's a setting of the blessing for Torah study. And it comes from this idea of traditionally when a teacher was teaching the Aleph Bet to a child, would put honey on the letters so that the first impression of this learning was this sweetness, this sweet taste. And I think about the tradition of some people when they come up for an aliyah and they take their talit and they touch it to the Torah scroll and kiss it, that they're bringing that Torah sweetness to their mouths. So I don't know if you've heard this before. It's by Dan Nichols, and I want to teach it to you. It goes like this. Sweet as honey, sweet as honey, sweet as honey on our tongue. You want to try it with me? Sweet as honey, sweet as honey on our tongue. You sound great. Let's do that again. The Torah blessing, which says la'asok b'divrei Torah, which is often translated as to engage in words of Torah, that blessed is Adonai for allowing us this commandment to engage in words of Torah. La'asok. But that word sounds like soak it up, right? It sounds like soaking up Torah, and that's what Dan Nichols did with these words. So he goes like this. They're so sweet, you have to wait for them. Let's try that together. Let us soak it up. Here we go. Let us soak it up. Let it all sink in. So those are our two parts. So I think we're going to get going with our sweet as honey over here. And then when we're ready, you guys are going to keep going with the sweet as honey, and you guys are going to do the let us thank you for singing with me. That was so much fun. So I wanted to share this beautiful teaching I learned from a teacher of mine, Cantor Ellen Dreskin. She was leading Tefillah recently at this really special music conference I actually took Barbara to in 2019. And we got to the Shema. We were approaching the Shema, and she talked about the Shema sandwich. I don't know if you've heard about this sandwich, but it is very special. So in the middle of the sandwich is the Shema. And on either side, there's this very special bread. And it is bread made of love. So before the Shema, in the evening, we have Ahavat Olam. This idea that God's love for us, God shows God's love for us through Torah and learning mitzvot, commandments and rules. And we feel this plural. This is God's love for all of us together. And then we have the Shema, and then on the other side we have the Ve'ahavta, which is about love, but it's our singular love for God that we show by the way that we live our lives, and that we're reminded of on the doorposts of our houses, and with our tefillin, and when we teach our children. So I wanted to share this beautiful love bread with you. A version of Ahavat Olam. It's a new version by Alana Arian, and I encourage you to listen to her new album called The Other Side of Fear. So this is from that. So I want to teach it to you. From that love for all of us to that love that we each show to God as we sing this beloved melody, Debbie Friedman's Ve'ahavta. I hope you'll join me, and you shall love. You shall love Adonai, your God, with all your heart, with all your soul, is so sacred to sing with you this evening to celebrate Shavuot together. So I wanted to end with a little Oseh Shalom medley. I feel we are always learning how to make peace. It is something we haven't quite figured out. And so as we sing these words, Oseh Shalom b'mromav, we think about how can we help to make peace in this crazy world. So we begin with a setting by Yoel Sykes of Nava Tehillah. I don't know if you've heard this one. Oseh Shalom b'mromav, Oyaseh Shalom aleinu, Ve'al kol Yisrael. I guess you've heard it, you sound amazing. Ve'al kol Shalom, that's kind of our anthem, this melody. Oseh Shalom b'mromav, Oyaseh Shalom aleinu, Ve'al kol Thank you so much for singing with me. Chag Sameach to you all. Thank you.
So you may, first of all, thank you, Cantor. That was beautiful. You may have noticed one of the names missing from the agenda this evening is Rabbi Teller. And Rabbi Teller, for the last 3 weeks, has had laryngitis. And so, yes, boo, exactly. As I've said, the voice of our congregation has no voice. So he's going to help us in the next part of our service because it's just limited speaking and an opportunity. But I wanted to begin by sharing with you, we've just heard some music. One of the things about music is it sets a tone. It creates a feel. As I think back to my years of growing up, I lived in New Jersey and I would drive down to the shore. The window open, I'm listening to music, and certain songs from that time echo in my head. And when I hear them, they make me reflect back on those moments. So it is with the music of Jewish prayer. So if you hear, for example, la, 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 it's time to get out the honey. Okay? You recognize it's an opportunity, get ready, that's the moment. What you're going to hear tonight in terms of the tefillah, you're going to recognize the words, which at the end of the day are the ultimate issue. That's where you should be most focused. But the melodies are different because they reflect the melodies of the three festivals of Shavuot, Sukkot, and Pesach. And so please be aware the melodies will be different than you're probably accustomed to, but nonetheless, that's our tradition, and it's meant to evoke a certain feeling and tradition from when we've grown up. With that in mind, Rabbi.
Friends, we're going to begin our Ma'ariv tonight on page 28 in our Sidur Sim Shalom. And the first thing we'll do is rise for the Baruch Hu. As we're seated, page 28. Praise to you, Adonai, our God who rules the universe. Don't get Dan rolling away with the
El Chai v'kayam tamid imlach aleinu le'olam va'ed baruch ata Adonai hamariv aravim.
Amen. Page 29, a prayer of love.
ואהבתך תסיר ממנו לעולמים ברוך אתה אדוני אוהב עמו ישראל שמע ישראל אדוני אלוהינו אדוני ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבבך ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם ותלך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך וקשרתם לאורך ידיך והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך.
Continue silently on page 30 to 31.
Adonai Elohim Emet.
Amen. Page 32.
ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם משה ובני ישראל לכנו שירה בשמחה רבה ויאמרו עולם מי כמוך באלים אדוני מי כמוך נדע בקודש נורתי לא ספר מלכותך ראו בניך בוקע גם לפני משה, זה ליאנו ויאמרו, אדוני אלוהים לעולם ועד, ונאמר כי פדה אדוני את יעקב וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו, ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל.
Amen. Page 33, a prayer for protection.
ופרוס עלינו סוכת שלומך, ברוך אתה אדוני, הפורש סוכת שלום עלינו וכל עמו ישראל וירושלים.
Amen. Page 34, we rise.
וידבר משה את מועדי אדוני אל בני ישראל, יתגדע ויתקדש שמי רבה, יאמר דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי בך יכונו יומכון וכידכו בן ישראל. ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי קודשה בריחו לילה מן כה ברכתיו שירתה תות ברכתה ונחמתה דמי רק בימה אמרו.
Opportunity for silent prayer begins on page 41, page 41b with the imahot, with our matriarchs. It's also a beautiful meditation on page 45 and 46, a few moments of silent prayer. Friends, if you're davening, please continue. We continue with Kaddish Shalom on page 48.
יתקרא ויקרא שמי רבה.
אמן.
יום דברה קירותי בימליך מלכותי בחייכון ובימייכון וחי לכל בית ישראל. בגלה בזמן קריב ימרו. אמן. יש מרבה מברך. לעולם עולם ימיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתאומה ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלה שמר קדושה בריחו לאל מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תפארתה ונחמתה דמירן ביעלמה ויאמרו אמן תקבל צלון הון ובעל הון לכל ישראל קודם אבו הון ושמיה ויאמרו אמן יש למה רבה מן שמאי וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו אמן עושה שלום במרומיו ויעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו.
Friends, we rise for the Kiddush, page 50.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם בורא פרי הגפן. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בחר בנו מכל העם ורוממנו מכל לשון וקידשנו במצוותיו ותיתן לנו אדוני אלוהינו באהבה מועדים לשמחה חגים וזמנים לששון את יום חג השבועות הזה זמן מתן תורתנו מקרא קודש זכר ליציאת מצרים כי בנו בחרת ואותנו קידשת מכל העמים ומועדי קודשך בשמחה ובששון הנחלתנו ברוך אתה אדוני מקדיש ישראל והזמנים.
On Saturday night, we add Havdalah, Borei Mur Ha'esh, so we'll be using our electric fire tonight.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם בורא מיורי האיש.
Amen.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם המבדיל בין קודש לקודש בין אור לחושך בין ישראל לעמים בין יום השביעי לששת ימי המעשה בין קדושת שבת לקדושת יום טוב הבדלת ואת יום השביעי מששת ימי המעשה קידשת הבדלת קידשת את עמך ישראל בקדושתך ברוך אתה אדוני המבדיל בין קודש לקודש ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה.
L'chaim, l'chaim. Page 51 for Aleinu.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, עתיק גדולה ליוצא בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמפקוד האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל העולם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ועומדים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא, שהוא נוטה השמיים ויוסר הארץ, ומשה יקרו בשמיים ממעל, ושכינתו זו בגויים מרומים, הוא אלוהינו אין עוד, אין מלכנו אין זולתנו.
You may be seated. Mourner's Kaddish can be found on page 52. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei Rabbi.
Amen.
Ve'alma divra kirute v'yamlich malchute v'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael ba'agala u'vizman kariv v'imru Amen.
Amen. Yehi shmei Rabba mevarach yalam lamei amaya.
Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudesha b'richu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata da'amiran be'alma v'imru Amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru Amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru Amen. Shavuot tov and Chag Sameach.
Good night, Rabbi. Several years ago, I went with Kehila High on one of their retreats to Galveston for a weekend. And in recent years, I've become a real history fan. And on the bus, I spent some time talking with Rabbi Morgen about history. And I realized that I was sitting at the foot of a scholar. And I came away very much with my tail between my legs. He didn't do that. Just my own feeling, in a sense of this truly is someone who has great wisdom. And so I want to invite Rabbi Steve Morgen from Beth Yeshurun to join us up here.
Oh boy, that's embarrassing. Okay. So first of all, I want to say that, hi, bye, I guess. It's really been an amazing experience tonight. I've been sort of getting into this. And so I hope that everybody here has been imagining ourselves standing at Mount Sinai, right, and getting ready to receive the 10 Commandments. That is actually what we're theoretically trying to do tonight. And so in various different ways, with people speaking and teaching different sources, and particularly with the music. I'm married to a Cantor also, and music definitely penetrates the soul in a way that unfortunately we rabbis have to admit words cannot. But in any case, I'm stuck with words. So I titled my talk tonight, Kedusha, you can see on the page. That's kind of a bland title. If I had been a little bit more of a promoter, let's say, I would have thought about it a little more, and I would have called it Kedusha, the Magical Mystery Tour. So what I'm going to try and do is, so we're imagining that we're standing at Sinai, and you want to have some encounter with God. You want to experience God's presence the way our ancestors did 3,200 years ago. And as many of the sources that have been discussed tonight said, that when we stood at Sinai, everybody felt God's presence in a very unique and personal way, the way that they personally could understand. So all I'm going to be able to do is give you some ideas, and then you have to take those ideas, if you wish, and run with them in your spiritual encounter. So the other thing I want to say now is, why am I talking about the Kedusha? Because our sages, when they created the prayer book for us, wanted to do a number of things. And one of the things they wanted to do was give us an opportunity to have that Sinai experience at least twice every day. Maybe sort of 2.5 times every day. So what do I mean by that? When we recite the Amidah, that's our private audience with God, right? That's the purpose of what I call the Texas three-step, where you take 3 steps back and 3 steps forward, right? The idea is you are imagining that you're coming into God's throne room, so to speak, right? And the first thing you do when you approach a king is to bow. And so on the opening blessing, Baruch atah Adonai, we're bowing, right? And then we begin our audience with God. We're imagining we're in God's presence, okay? And the first blessing of that is our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we add Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah. And we imagine that we are speaking to God saying, you know, I'm just a puny little human being here, but we have a long history with you going back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, and each of them had an individual relationship with you, and sort of collectively we're coming to approach you. So that's how I introduce myself to God in his presence. Then the next blessing is about God's power. Mechaye metim in the traditional words. For those of you who are Reformed Jews, it was changed to Mechaye Hakol. The point is that God has the power of life over death. He is a powerful God. Many of you probably have heard me talk about this before. My parallel is, or the paradigm that I think about, unfortunately, is the Wizard of Oz. Dorothy comes into the Wizard of Oz's chamber, right, and she's overwhelmed and terrified by the presence of this huge face barking out to her, right? But she's come with her friends, right? Not too helpful friends. The Scarecrow doesn't have any brains, and the Tin Man doesn't have a heart, and the Cowardly Lion. But anyway, they're friends so that she's got some support, and we're bringing Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, a little bit stronger support for ourselves. And then, of course, you acknowledge that God is greater than the Wizard of Oz. He is the great, almighty, powerful God, right? And he has even the power of life over death. So that's the second blessing. Now that we got the introductions out of the way, comes the Kedusha, and that's the moment that our ancestors gave us to have this encounter with God that is supposed to be like the scene at Mount Sinai. And that's why I chose to talk about it tonight. Now, the Kedusha that I'm going to talk about is the full Kedusha, which is only done when there's a full repetition of the Amidah, which you notice we didn't do at Mariv because it's not done in the evening. That's why I said we get to do it twice a day, morning and afternoon. And for those of you who want to see it, it's on page 3 of my handout. This is the one from the Siddur we use at Beth Yeshurun. It's from Siddur Lev Shalem. Very similar in Sim Shalom. The Reform movement has the Kedusha. It's a slightly different version of the Kedusha. But for our purposes tonight, it doesn't matter. Uses the same 3 biblical verses that I'm going to talk about tonight. Okay, so that's the Kedusha. That's your moment to have this intense Sinai experience. Okay, so how do we know this? Well, modern prayer book scholars have told us that or Talmud scholars have told us that the rabbis of the Talmudic period were mystics and engaged in what they called Ma'aseh Merkava mysticism. Merkava means chariot and refers to Ezekiel's chariot. And it was his vision of God. And they would meditate on 2 verses in particular to try and have that God experience. And they both are coming from 2 prophets, Isaiah and Ezekiel, who had their own God experiences. And in each case, it was when that prophet had his first encounter with God. It's when they are commissioned to be a prophet, a messenger for God. And they imagine in that moment that they're standing in heaven and seeing God on his throne, whatever that means. And then they describe that experience in words. Now, the words are going to sound weird to us because we now follow hopefully most of us here follow Maimonides, who believes that God is not an old man sitting on a throne, has no physical form, no particular shape. And so we have to transform their very graphic imagery into metaphors, right? I'm trying to get our minds to think about how we might imagine God. When I imagine God, I imagine the universe like pictures of the starry night and the Milky Way and galaxies in distant places, because it kind of makes me realize the immensity of the universe and therefore the enormity of the creator of the universe. So that's how I do it. But however you do it, that's how you do it. We're going to see how Isaiah and Ezekiel did it. Okay. So in any case, they would meditate on these experiences, and then they would feel like they were having this close encounter with God on what you might call a magical mystery tour, right? Or a magical mystical tour, right? A mystical experience. So let's talk about Isaiah. So Isaiah, by the way, so the sources behind here, I don't read as fast as Rabbi Estes does, so we're not going to run through all these sources. I gave them to you so you can go home and meditate on them and have your magical mystical tour, if you want to. The full text of Isaiah's encounter is on one page, and the full text of Ezekiel's is on several pages. I have put in a box the particular verses that I wanted to focus on, and since wonderfully this was done in color, the red boxes are the ones that are actually quoted in the Kedusha. But you don't need to look at those because I'm going to do the cliff notes for you. I learned in law school how to do cliff notes, and so that's what this is over here, the outline. So let's look at Isaiah. So Isaiah's appointed to be a prophet of God in chapter 6. And he sees God's throne room, and he sees angels with 6 wings. And they're fluttering around God's throne. V'kara zeh el zeh v'yamar. And one would call to the other and say, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Svaot, Milo kol haaretz kavodo. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole world is filled with his presence. And we, in case you were wondering, we bounce on our feet when we say Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. If you were wondering why we're bouncing on our feet, it's because we are imagining that we are those angels in God's throne room fluttering around the throne. And so we're bouncing on our heels. And by the way, people, some of us do anyway, when we say V'kara zeh el zeh, and one called to the other, I turn to the person on my left, and then I turn to the person on my right. V'kara zeh, I called to this one. El zeh, to that one, right? And why are we doing that? Because we're all angels. We're calling to each other, and then bouncing on our heels, fluttering around God's throne, saying, Kadosh, 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 okay? So that's Isaiah's vision. Ezekiel's vision is more complicated. That's why it goes on for several pages. It's really weird. Talk about a magical mystery tour. He probably was like the Beatles on a real magical mystery tour, having done some, not coffee. In any case, we'll just look at a few of the things that he said about this tour. So Ezekiel is commissioned by God to be his messenger, his prophet, and he's in his throne room, and he sees the angels, and these angels have 4 faces, right? One on each side, okay? So on one side, it is a human, one is a lion, one is an eagle, and one is an ox. And I don't know what that is supposed to look like. First of all, an ox has an enormous head, an eagle has a little tiny head. I don't know how that kind of works, but don't worry about it. So again, he might have been just hallucinating, or you can take what one scholar said, which I kind of like, and that is that these are icons. We understand icons now in the modern technological world. They're icons. That is to say, they're symbolic of something, right? So the ox is a very strong, powerful creature. The eagle can fly and soar. It takes care of its young. Sometimes we say it has good eyesight, eagle eyes. So whatever aspect of eagles is that nature of the angel. The lion is fierce and king of the jungle. And of course, the human has wisdom and intelligence and has a moral agency, right? And so these angels have all of these qualities wrapped in one. That, I think, is what the prophet is trying to say in symbolic language. And then he imagines that these angels have 2 legs fused together into one, and they only have like 1 foot. And so you may notice that when some people do the Amidah, if they're doing it the technically correct way, which I don't even always do, but technically correct is you're supposed to fuse your feet together completely, like you're standing on 1 leg. And the reason you do that is because, again, we're imitating those angels in Ezekiel's vision who seem to have only 1 leg. Okay, and then toward the end in chapter 3, it says, and a spirit carried me away, and behind me I heard a great voice Baruch kavod Adonai mimkamo. Blessed is God's presence from its place. So there's the statement from Ezekiel. So we've got these two sentences from these two prophets, and the idea was the rabbis are trying to tell us, when you have your own mystical experience, think about the mystical experience of how Isaiah and Ezekiel managed to feel like they were in God's presence. And then they add one more verse, and this verse is not from a prophet, it is from Psalms 146. It's the last verse in Psalm 146, and it says, Yimloch Adonai le'olam Elohai Tzion l'dor vador, hallelujah, right? Everybody sounds familiar, right? The Lord shall reign forever, you, O God, O Zion, will rule from generation to generation, praise God. This is possibly inserted into the Kedusha, as I note here in my notes, as a prayer for the Messianic era to begin. That is, when the Kedusha was composed, we're having our intense moment with God up in the heavens, and that is so powerful and so amazing and so incredible, and we want to bring some of that back down here on earth. And what happens when God's presence is manifest into the whole world? That's the Messianic era. And therefore, I think maybe the prayer writer included this verse to indicate that if we could just capture that experience and get everybody to experience that in the world, we would create the Messianic world right in our presence. So that's sort of from the three verses aspect of it. One other aspect I want to talk about is this was often done in rabbinic commentaries and piyutim, rabbinic poetry, that was based on these opening three blessings of the Amidah. They imagined that the Avot prayer, the first one about our ancestors, was mostly about Abraham. It was still a patriarchal world. They didn't think about Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah so much, unfortunately. But it was about Abraham, right? And the seal for the blessing is Magen Avraham, right? The shield of Abraham. So the first blessing is Abraham's prayer. The second one, they said, is Isaac's prayer, Mechaye Metim, who brings life to the dead. Why? Because Isaac was nearly sacrificed. He almost died, or in some midrashim, he actually did die and God brought him back to life again. And so the second blessing about God's power of life over death is Isaac's prayer. And that, of course, means that the Kedusha, our prayer, is Jacob's prayer. And from Jacob's prayer, we learn, why is it Jacob's prayer about the Kedusha? Because Jacob had that moment also of feeling God's presence. When? When he ran away from home. And the first night he was away from home, he puts a stone under his head and he falls asleep, and he has a dream or a vision about a stairway to heaven. That's a different song, Led Zeppelin, not the Beatles. He imagines the stairway to heaven, and he sees God standing up in the throne room and saying, Jacob, it's going to be all right. I'm going to be with you on your journey, right? So he has that God experience. And therefore, the third blessing about having a God experience is Jacob's prayer. When he wakes up in the morning, the take-home message for me is, when he wakes up in the morning, he says 3b, for you, those who are following in the outline here, surely the Lord is present in this place, and I did not know it. He thought he was just camping out in the middle of nowhere. Turns out it's the gateway to heaven. How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God and the gateway to heaven. And what does that actually tell us? Anywhere we happen to be, whether we're sleeping or awake, can be a gateway to heaven. Surely in a synagogue where we stand before the Ark and the Ten Commandments on Shavuot, this can be the gateway to heaven. We're like Jacob, saying the Kedusha, imagining that we're going up to be in God's presence. Now, my modern interpretation of this prayer depends a lot on that last verse from Psalms. So for that one, I do want to actually take a look at the psalm itself. So you can turn to the one that says Psalm 146. And just, I'm going to look at the last few verses. Maybe let's say from verse 5. Happy is he who has the God of Jacob, for his help, whose hope is in the Lord his God, maker of heaven and earth, the sea and all that's in them, who keeps faith forever. So again, when the person who put the Kedusha together quoted this verse from Psalms, he might have also wanted us to remember the context of the verse he's quoting. right? So bring in all this context. It's not just God's going to reign forever and ever. He's describing who this God is. He is the creator of heavens and earth, the sea, that's all that's in it. He secures justice for those who are wronged. He gives food to the hungry. He sets prisoners free. The Lord restores sight to the blind. He makes those who are bent over straight. God loves the righteous. He watches over the stranger. He gives courage to the orphan and widow. He makes the path of the wicked tortuous. And then it concludes, God will reign forever and ever, right? Now, we're modern people here. And I don't know about you, but I'm looking around the world today, and I don't see this happening. This is not happening. I don't see justice. I don't see food given to the hungry all the time. I don't see people who are wrongly imprisoned being set free, unfortunately. I don't see people who are blind being restored to their sight, people who are bent over made straight. It doesn't happen in the world. So why? So now when I imagine the Kedusha, and of course this doesn't happen to me every time, I'm like you. Sometimes I'm davening, I'm not thinking, I'm mouthing words. When I'm focusing on it and I'm thinking about it and I'm imagining I'm standing in God's presence in God's throne room, and I'm imagining what a beautiful universe God created, and wouldn't it be great if we could bring that presence down here, I'm reminded of this psalm that tells us to feed the hungry, to secure justice for those who are wronged, to restore the sight for the blind, to straighten up those who are bent over. It's us that has to do it. We are God's agents. We are God's morals agents in making this world happen. If we want to bring God's presence into this world, that supreme exalting experience that we might have from time to time when we feel like we're standing in God's presence, we want to make it happen here, we need to make it happen. Like it was said earlier, Nachshon ben Aminadav jumped into the water. Why are we complaining to God? That's what he created us to do. He gave us hands and feet. He gave us commandments to live by, and we're supposed to bring about this Messianic era. So when I think of the Kedusha, and I have that magical mystery tour experience, I then try to bring it back into this world, and that's what we're charged to do. So while we're standing here at Sinai and getting all charged up, tomorrow morning, or not tomorrow morning, it's still Yontif, after Yontif, right, we're going to go out into the world and make it a better place. Shavuot Tov.
So I do want to endorse the perception of Ezekiel, as Rabbi Morgen suggested. Every time I read chapter 1 of Ezekiel, what goes through my mind is the movie When Harry Met Sally. I'll have what he's having. A little bit of a change of schedule. Our next scholar this evening is Rabbi Oren Hayon, who is from Congregation Emanu. I've not had the opportunity to really get to know you, but I feel like I know you really well through someone we share and love together very much. So I look forward to hearing your words this evening.
Hi everybody, Chag Sameach. So good to be with you. It's great to be learning together with you, and a thrill to get to share this space of learning and illumination with so many other teachers and colleagues who I love and respect so much. I want to start with a little anecdote. When I was a first-year rabbinical student, one of my professors that I learned with in Jerusalem was a Haredi academic, a very observant Haredi professor who was an expert in the field of biblical archaeology. And every time we learned together at the beginning of every session, he would come in and tell us what we could expect to learn in that session. He would always start by saying, Bezras Hashem, today we're going to learn, with God's help, today we're going to learn this. Bezras Hashem, with God's help, today we're going to learn this other thing. So one day he came into class and he said, Bezras Hashem, today we're going to learn about the parting of the Red Sea, and Bezras Hashem, we're going to learn that it never happened. So I remember being so taken by the irony of him starting off a session in which we would learn about let's say the weak archaeological record to support the story of the parting of the Red Sea. And so in that spirit, tonight, my friends, Bezras Hashem, we're going to learn how to gossip. We're going to learn all about how to be very effective spreaders of gossip and slander And hopefully, Bezras Hashem, we will learn how to guard our tongues and our speech according to the guidance of Jewish ethics and Jewish values. So I, unlike Rabbi Morgen, I did not spend any time in law school, so I can talk to you tonight about the Jewish values and laws that govern the way that we speak, and not the American civil laws and restrictions about how we speak, what words we spread verbally or in writing. We do know that in American law, it matters whether the words that we spread are published in the press or whether we say them in conversation. It matters whether or not the person about whom we're speaking can demonstrate damage. We know that it matters what was in our mind motivating the words that we spread. And so I'm going to ask you for the next 18 minutes or so to sort of set aside what we know about slander and libel in American law, and to put ourselves into a slightly different mindset when we learn about the Jewish law governing Lashon Hara, governing, let's say, the evil speech of a tongue that is designed to hurt and defame. So to guide our learning together, you'll see in our text sheet we have 3 bullet points that will help us set a bit of a framework around how we understand the Jewish ethics of speech. First of all, the most common sort of catch-all term about defamatory speech in Jewish life is Lashon Hara, the evil tongue. But strictly speaking, the boundaries of that category govern speech that is true. This is not a made-up, strictly speaking, Lashon Hara is not a made-up falsehood that you're spreading to hurt somebody else's feelings or hurting their reputation. Lashon Hara, in its strict definition, is something that is true, often unknown to others. Let's say a fact that would cause damage were it to be made public. But it doesn't matter whether you're spreading Lashon Hara verbally, whether you're writing a note and passing it to somebody in class, whether you're buying a billboard on 59 and putting the words up there in 10-foot-high letters, or whether you're publishing an article in the newspaper to get out the word and hurt somebody else in society. So that's the catch-all term for Jewish wicked speech or hurtful speech, Lashon Hara. And in Jewish law, the prohibition exists not just on being the one who says the things you shouldn't say, but also being one who listens to the thing that ought not to be said. And thirdly, by being a person who believes something that should not be spread. So you can sort of take a second now to think about times in which you found yourselves occupying one category or the other. Sometimes we can feel very noble indeed by telling ourselves how righteous we are because we never say things that could hurt another person's reputation. But if we're there to hear them, and certainly if we're there to believe them and change our behavior toward a third party accordingly, then we too are culpable under the Jewish laws governing Lashon Hara. Now, in a separate category, or at least maybe a subcategory of Lashon Hara, is the category of Hotza'at Shem Ra, spreading a bad name. Now, this is what a lot of time we imagine we're saying when we talk about gossip and slander. This is speech about things that are not true, false speech that has the potential to cause harm, telling a lie about somebody else, which similarly, if it were to get out and get spread, would hurt somebody's business or reputation or relationships. And in the case of Hotza'at Shem Ra, when you're talking trash about another person, you are guilty of a sin whether or not your words have demonstrably caused harm to another person in a way that can be quantified. The victim doesn't have to be able to take you before court and say that I've lost this many sales in my business or this many friendships were damaged because this other person told a lie about me. Simply telling a lie about another person is enough to qualify as a sin for which we need to seek restitution. Okay, so that's our background about the big categories of Jewish law that govern the way that we speak, the way that we spread words about other people. I'm going to share this text now from Arachim, from the Bavli, from the Babylonian Talmud. It was taught in the academy of Rabbi Yishmael, whoever speaks Lashon Hara spreads sin equivalent to the 3 cardinal sins: idol worship, sexual immorality, and murder. So if you know anything about Jewish law, these 3 cardinal sins are the biggies. These are so big and so bad that in classical Jewish law, everything else pales in comparison to these categories of law, so much so that you should be willing to die rather than transgress these 3 laws. The classic example is if someone comes to you and puts a gun to your head, God forbid, and says, I'm going to pull the trigger unless you worship an idol, or unless you commit this act of sexual immorality, or unless you kill another person, The classical Jewish texts say you should be willing to give up your own life rather than commit these 3 sins: idol worship, sexual immorality, and murder. So imagine how grandiose this claim is from the Academy of Rabbi Ishmael, that talking badly about another person rises to the level of these 3 cardinal sins. Now, it may be hyperbole that Rabbi Ishmael and his Talmidim were trying to undertake by talking so seriously and so exaggeratedly about Lashon Hara, but it helps illustrate how seriously he and his students took these restrictions on Lashon Hara. In the land of Israel, they said, the tongue slays 3. The one who speaks it, the one who accepts it or the one who hears it, and the one about whom it is spoken. Again, if you sort of take a minute to think about a case in your life, imagine a rumor that was spread or a story that was propagated, and the damage that it did both to the person who spread it and the person who heard it and the person about whom it was spoken. All right, so here are the guidelines about how to be a really effective spreader of Lashon Hara. And conversely, the things that you should avoid if you want to avoid being guilty of this sin. So we're going to go quickly through these bullet points that govern the laws of Lashon Hara. And this also will help, I think, dispel some misconceptions we have about what one needs to do in order to be a spreader of gossip or slander. Now, there are some loopholes in Jewish law about ways that you can get around certain restrictions if upholding them would cause grievous material damage to your business, for example. But Lashon Hara does not fall under those categories. One may not tell lies, one may not speak Lashon Hara, speak hurtful truths in order to avoid financial loss. So I'm giving you some examples of ways that you can use these in your everyday life. You can't talk about your competitor's product by saying, our product doesn't have the defects that he's has, and therefore you should shop by us and not by him. Even though doing so will improve your bottom line, you can't say that because doing so is considered Lashon Hara. You can't speak Lashon Hara, you can't tell damaging truths in order to avoid damage to your own reputation. So here I'm imagining that the word has gotten out that your team has made a pitch to another business or made a presentation to a potential buyer, and the buyer, the client, prospective client, was unimpressed by your failure, and to cover your own backside, you might be tempted to say, the reason that we failed wasn't my fault. All these other yahoos that were in there with me, they're the ones that made us fail. They weren't prepared. Even if it's true that they weren't prepared, you can't say that in order to preserve your own reputation as the star of your team at the office. Okay? Not another invalid excuse for spreading Lashon Hara. Anonymity, though we and the internet might like us to think otherwise, is not a valid loophole. You can't post anonymously in order to spread the word about somebody else. You can't post under a pseudonym or write an anonymous note or put a note in the break room door to try to call somebody else out. Anonymity is not an excuse that will preserve you from the consequences of Lashon Hara. I'm not mentioning any names, but similarly, you can't cover your Lashon Hara with a joke by telling something harmful about another person, getting the other person to listen to the Lashon Hara and then saying, oh, I'm just kidding. I was just joking. You shouldn't have taken it seriously. We can't do that. Even subtle implication of the damage that would be implied by Lashon Hara, by harmful truth, is forbidden. You think about somebody who gets into law school and you say, isn't it amazing that Moshe, of all people, is going to be a lawyer? Can you imagine that this guy was invited to sit on the ethics committee? Right? Even though you haven't said explicitly that he shouldn't be included on the ethics committee because of his behavior, your implication is that there's something flawed in his personality and therefore he's unfit for that position. And that is considered Lashon Hara and it's forbidden by Jewish law. Here's our last one. You also are not excused from the restrictions of Lashon Hara by including yourself as the victims or the objects about which you're speaking as a way of mitigating damage. Yeah, we had a few too many drinks, we were probably a little liberal with the pours, but everybody in our industry probably drinks too much. Everybody's a little bit immodest, everybody does that, everybody cuts corners, everybody turns a blind eye to the workplace safety restrictions. You can't do those things even if you are included in the people about whom you're speaking. All right, so here's the good news. Here's what you've all been waiting for. Here's what you've waited up until almost 10 o'clock to hear. Here's how I can excuse you from speaking Lashon Hara. You ready? This is great news. Now, these methods by which you can excuse your Lashon Hara, look at how beautiful our sages are, and look how forgiving and charitable they are about the intentions of our fellow Jews. All of these ways for which you can excuse and be permitted Lashon Hara exist under the following presumption. The presumption is that I'm saying something true but damaging about my friend because I want him to change his ways and repent. And in a very genuine and charitable way, not because I want him to feel terrible, or because I want people to make fun of him, or because I want his reputation to be damaged, but I'm telling these things about the sins he's committed because I know he has the potential to be better, and I want to see him improve. All right, so all of that is the presumption that these laws exist under, that there are certain times in which you can say something true but damaging about another person, but only if it comes out of a kind heart and a true desire to see them change their ways. All right, here we go. If I want to say something true and damaging about another person, I have to have firsthand knowledge of the situation I plan to speak about. Now, we can pick any imaginable case that might be a subject for Lashon Hara. Remember, that's a true statement that has the possibility to cause damage. My friend has failed to pay his workers on time. He's withheld his employees an honest wage. Maybe he violates Jewish law. Maybe he violates the moral or ethical standards he's supposed to be held to. But I can't say that aloud unless I have personally witnessed myself the behaviors that I'm going to talk about. I can't spread Lashon Hara based on a rumor, based on an implication, or based on something I heard whispered in the hallway. I have to have seen him doing the things that I'm talking about. Now, if I plan to speak out about the thing that person has done, I have to do my research. I can't speak out of passion or anger or resentment. I can't speak out of the fact that he took a job that should be mine, or he earned a contract that should have been mine, or that he got someone to go out with him who should have gone out with me instead. I have to do my research and make sure that the act that I'm speaking about constitutes a bona fide violation of Jewish law. So again, now we're narrowing the pathway through which permissible Lashon Hara can pass. So now let's say that we are talking about the fact that he's refused his employees a decent wage. Or maybe we want to talk about the fact that he's committed a ritual sin, which in our community must be upheld. Once I've determined, again, quietly and anonymously, I can't go and stand up in front of the congregation and say, I hear that the Cantor committed a sin on Shabbos, and I just want to make sure we're not supposed to be eating cheeseburgers on Shabbos, right? Hypothetically speaking, of course. Right? I can't do that. I have to quietly and subtly do my research to make sure that the act I'm about to talk about is in fact a violation of Jewish law. Before I talk out about it publicly, now I'm in number 3, my first step has to be to meet with my friend quietly, subtly, and anonymously to speak to him heart to heart. Now, if you've gotten to step 3 already, I think most of the wind has been taken out of the sails of Lashon Hara. If the thing that you want to say about another person that could hurt them is something that you'd consider saying to them quietly and intimately and face to face, already I think a lot of the pain and the anger and the agitation that usually comes with Lashon Hara has already been leached out. Because I'm coming to the friend with love and intimacy and concern. Now, if I'm ready to come to them with love and intimacy and concern, then we can move forward through this process, and I can say, I'm worried because of what I saw at your warehouse, or I'm worried about the way that I saw you speak to your spouse. I feel worried about the way that you treated that animal. And I'm going to talk to you face to face and one-on-one because I'm worried about you and not worried about being the person who has the good dirt to share at the break room. What I plan to say to the person that I love and care about has to be completely and objectively true, without exaggeration or strategic omissions. This is really hard. It's really hard when we're trying to make a point and we see ourselves as being the noble person who's in the right. Sometimes it's really hard to avoid dramatic overstatement or hyperbole, but simply to take a step back in humility and modesty and say, I'm worried because I see you walking down this path. This is the behavior that I observed, and this is what makes me feel worried about it from the perspective of Jewish tradition and Jewish value. And I'm telling you this, number 5, because I love you. And I know that you're capable of great things. And I wanted to talk to you quietly because I think you are capable of more. Now imagine every time if we wanted to speak Lashon Hara about somebody, every time we wanted to talk trash about somebody else, if instead we sort of pivoted on that impulse and spoke to them quietly out of love and not out of the desire to have something good and juicy to tell our friends. Now, number 6 tells us that before I talk to somebody else about the things that I saw them do that I think is hurtful and damaging, I have to have gone through every other alternative means of pressuring the other party to change their ways. You know, maybe I talk to them about the fact that maybe I can be helpful to them in changing the safety standards at their warehouse, or maybe I can be helpful to them in figuring out the tip next time we go out together because I feel like the workers who wait on us are deserved extra compensation. Maybe there are other ways sort of subtly that won't embarrass them. As you know, we're always worried about the preservation of someone else's pride and reputation in Jewish tradition. So maybe we can find other ways of helping them preserve their pride and reputation before speaking out. Lastly, I must determine that my speech won't bring about greater damage than the decision not to speak out about it at all. Maybe sometimes it's okay to let it go, and we have to do a little mental calculus about what the reputational damage to someone else will be by having me speak to them versus just letting it go, and knowing that one stiffed tip may not be worse than calling somebody out in front of our friends. Maybe one overlooked cut corner is worth it. But sometimes, and with this I'll close, sometimes we've done the best we can, and looking back over a year or so, we find that we haven't always lived up to these standards of protecting our speech, the things that we say and write and post and tweet and text about other people. Sometimes we've been immodest and we've been too hasty, and sometimes we've shared words designed to hurt rather than to help. And so when that happens, the standards about how we make restitutions are the same. You'll recognize these from the liturgy that we share in the High Holy Days. The first thing we have to do is recognize that we did something wrong. We have to tell God privately that we have done wrong, and then we have to commit ourselves not to do the same thing again in the future. But if the Lashon Hara we have spread damages another person's livelihood, reputation, or relationships, our atonement must also include making personal amends and financial restitution, if applicable. If the things we've said have hurt their property or their business, we have to make good on the damage that we have caused. And lastly, maybe most difficult, we have to seek personal restitution from the person we have harmed. And the reason that I think this is most important and most difficult is that a lot of times the words that we speak are designed to hurt the other person because of a grudge or a resentment or our own hurts inside. And so our law and our tradition has guided us through a path that forces us into a position of humility and modesty, willingness to sort of lower ourselves in the esteem of others and in the esteem of God, to recognize that other person's pride and dignity is just as important as our own. So friends, as we make our way into this holy night of study, into, God willing, another year of deepened relationship with Torah and with God and with our other people, let's remember that the words that we use are vitally freighted, that the things we say are incredibly important and incredibly powerful, and let us use our words and our tongues for good and not evil. Good Gents of everybody, Chag Sameach.
Just looking, Rabbi Strauss is here? 2 minutes, all right. So in 1995 and 1996, I was living in Dallas, and I had the great honor of being part of a team that led 60 teenagers to Israel each of those summers for 6 weeks. Early in process, I learned that I'd be sharing that experience with a young rabbinical student by the name of Brian Strauss. And I had really the blessing of being able to sit with him on a night-by-night basis, talk Torah, talk theology, explore all sorts of Jewish ideas. I also had the pleasure of watching him interact with the teenagers with whom we were charged, and I came away saying, this young man is special. This young man is going to make a difference. Young man's not so young anymore. Rabbi Brian Strauss and Beth Yeshurun.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to see everyone here. Great to be with all of you as we celebrate this holiday. And it's nice to have all the community together. So at a dinner to celebrate the work of a communal leader, the guest speaker paid tribute to his many qualities: his dedication, his hard work, his foresight. As he sat down, the leader leaned over and said, "You forgot to mention one thing about me." "What was that?" asked the speaker. The leader replied, "My humility." Humility is something we respect. We appreciate it when we find it in a family member, in a friend, or in a community leader. Moses, of course, was known, as the Torah tells us, we'll read in a few weeks, very humble, more than any other man who was ever on the face of the earth. Humility is a good thing. But humility taken to the extreme can cause problems. In fact, the rabbis in the Talmud make the point forcefully through a great story. It's a story we're going to go over now. It's a story you've heard before, but perhaps for a different reason. Let's begin. If you open up your study packet, and you'll find the story, let's see where it is, last few pages. It's after Rabbi Morgen. Let's see. There it is, where it says, "Don't be so humble, Rabbi Brian Strauss." Everyone see that? It's like the third or fourth page from the back. So this is a very important story. You've probably heard it before, but as I said, probably for a different reason. Everyone has it there? Don't be so humble. Let's read this story. So the Gemara explains Jerusalem was destroyed on account of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. There was a certain man whose friend was named Kamsa, and whose enemy was named Bar Kamsa. He once made a large feast and said to his servant, "You know what? Where's Kamsa? Go get my friend Kamsa. Have him come to this party." The servant went, and he made a mistake. He didn't bring Kamsa. Who did he bring? His enemy, Bar Kamsa. The man who was hosting the feast came and found Bar Kamsa, his enemy, sitting at the feast. And what did the host say to Bar Kamsa? "That man is the enemy of that man. You are my enemy. What do you want here? Arise and leave. Get out. You're my enemy. Who invited you?" Bar Kamsa said to him, "Since I've already come, you know what? Be cool. Let me stay. And I'll give you money for whatever I eat and drink. Just don't embarrass me by sending me out." The host said to him, "No, you must leave. Get out." Bar Kamsa said to him, Look, I'll give you money for half of the feast. Just don't send me away." The host said to him, "No, you must leave." So Bar Kamsa really didn't want to go. It's a big party. Everyone's there. It's a who's who. And he didn't want to be embarrassed. So Bar Kamsa says, "You know what? I'll give you money for the entire feast. Just let me say." Now, if someone said that to me at one of my kids' bar mitzvah parties, I would have taken the money. You could have been my worst enemy ever. But the host said, "No, that's not good enough. You must leave." Finally, the host took Bar Kamsa by his hand, stood him up, and basically threw him out. Now, what's the lesson you've heard before? You've heard this story before, right? What holiday, or maybe you have, if you've heard this story, what holiday do we usually tell this story? Tisha B'Av, right? Right? It's the senseless hatred. Sinai Chinam, right? Ceaseless hatred amongst Jews. These are two Jews, right? These are during Roman times. The Jews can't get along, hence the temple was destroyed. But now we're going to go to the conclusion of the story. There's actually something important that you may not have learned about the story before that I want to get to tonight. After having been cast out from the feast, Bar Kamsa said to himself, "Since the sages were sitting there and did not protest the actions of the host, although they saw how he humiliated me, learn from it they were content with what he did." So I often think about that. You know, as a rabbi, I'm blessed to be a rabbi. I imagine if it was a big party here in Houston and all the rabbis in Houston were there, I have enough faith in my colleagues, I hope I would be strong enough to do it too, to say something to the host, like, "You know what? Let it be. Don't embarrass the guy. He's a fellow Jew. Don't embarrass him. But apparently, according to the story, the great sages of Jerusalem didn't have that strength. And so Bar Kokhba is upset. I will therefore go and inform against them to the king, the Roman king. He went and he said to the Roman emperor, the Jews are rebelled against you. The emperor said to him, who says that this is the case? Bar Kokhba said to him, go and test them. Send them an offering to be brought in honor of the government and see whether they will sacrifice it. The emperor went and sent with him a choice 3-year-old calf. While Bar Kokhba was coming with the calf to the temple, what does he do? He makes a blemish on the calf's upper lip. And some say he made a blemish on the eyelids, a place where, according to us, halakha, it's a blemish, and according to them, the Gentile rulers, for their offerings, it's not a blemish. So what happens if there's a blemish on a sacrifice? You can't make the sacrifice, right? So Bar Kokhba is basically setting up the Jews. Therefore, when Bar Kokhba brought the animal to the temple, the priest would not sacrifice it on the altar because it was blemished. But they also could not explain this satisfactorily to the Gentile authorities, who do not consider it to be blemished. Right? So the Romans are like, dude, that's not really a blemish. Sacrifice it. So we can't sacrifice it. Any blemish is a blemish. The blemish notwithstanding, the sages know it's going to cause problems with the Romans. The sages thought to sacrifice the animal as an offering due to the imperative to maintain peace with the government. Right? Just sacrifice it. Let's break the rule. We don't want to get in trouble with the Romans. And who is the leader? Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkalos. And he said to them, if the priests do that, people will say that blemished animals may be sacrificed as offerings on the altar. Guys, I'm sorry, we can't do that. I know the Romans are going to be upset, but if we offer this blemished animal, it's going to ruin everything. But the sages said, okay, if we don't sacrifice it, we must prevent Bar Kokhba from reporting this to the emperor. The sages thought to kill him so that he would not go and speak against them. Right? I mean, the sages are saying, you know what? We don't want to kill someone, but Bar Kokhba does this, a lot more people are going to get killed. And they go back to the Rabbi Zechariah, and say to them, go kill him. Can we go kill him? And he says to them, if you kill him, people will say that one who makes a blemish on sacrificial animals is to be killed. So again, he won't go through with it. He's afraid. As a result, they did nothing. Bar Kokhba's slander was accepted by the authorities, and consequently, the war between the Jews and the Romans began, which ended up with the destruction of the Second Temple. And here's the important line right here. In reporting this story, Rabbi Yochanan says, the excessive humility of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkalos destroyed our temple, burned our sanctuary, and exiled us from our land. The excessive humility. Why the criticism? And why does he say it's the excessive humility of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkalos? To get an answer, I went to Musar. Musar is the study of Jewish values, to work on our qualities like patience and anger, equanimity, to make us more balanced individuals. And I want to share some wisdom from one of my teachers, Al Marinas, the founder of the Musar Institute. So why the criticism? Because you would think the rabbis of the Talmud would say, you know what? I kind of understand why our colleague did this. You can't go kill a fellow Jew just because he may go inform on us. And you can't offer a blemished animal. It's the Beit HaMikdash, it's the temple. But they criticized the rabbi. And they criticized him by saying it's his excessive humility. Why the criticism? And what does that mean, excessive humility? They're saying to them, and they're saying to you and me thousands of years later, by not offering a blemished animal, by not condoning and allowing the killing of Bar Kokhba, he actually manifested too much humility. He shrank from the task he had been handed. He held the fate of the temple and his people in his hands. He's the leader of the Jewish people. And yet he seemed to say, who am I to make such unprecedented decisions that will potentially mislead the people as to the law? He had the opportunity. He was supposed to take it, and he failed. And this was excessive humility. His sense of himself was flawed. He saw himself as less capable than he actually was of solving a real-life dilemma of such great consequence. From Musar perspective, he gave up too much space. He was the leader of the Jewish people, an opportunity to save our temple. He could take a lot of space. He could go above and beyond to make a change. And he failed to see it in himself, and he failed to do it. For you see, I think the rabbis are teaching all of us, humility is not an extreme quality, but rather a balanced, moderate, accurate understanding of yourself that you act on in your life. Humility and self-esteem go hand in hand. On the one extreme, you have arrogance. Arrogance has an insatiable appetite for space. It claims, it occupies, it suffocates others. We all know people who are arrogant. It's hard to have a conversation with them. It's usually about them. It's usually about their needs, their wants, their space. And the opposite extreme is self-debasement. Shrinking from occupying any space whatsoever, it retracts meekly inside itself. Rabbi Zechariah ben Avklos is the perfect example of not having proper humility. Humility is about occupying your proper amount of space. He was the leader. He didn't occupy that proper amount of space. And by not taking the appropriate actions, he didn't take his appropriate space. If a leader as great as Moses was so humble, there's surely more to humility than the shrinking meekness we ordinarily associate with the term. Humility doesn't mean being a nobody. It means being no more of a somebody than you ought to be. So this Shavuot, as we study Torah, and we have an opportunity to work on our own qualities, let's ask ourselves honestly, in your relationships with those closest to you, do you express humility by limiting yourself to taking up just the appropriate space that God has given you, while still leaving room for others? When someone close to you shares a piece of news with you, do you come right back with your own concerns, filling the space they've opened? Or do you make room to follow up what the other person has introduced? When a loved one is celebrating a special occasion, do you keep it all about them? Or do you find a way to make it about you? When it comes to making decisions with those closest to you, do you let your loved ones have an opinion? Or do you dominate the discussion? In other words, do you leave enough space in your life for others rather than jamming up your world with yourself? Or is there space you ought rightfully to occupy that you need to stretch into, like Rabbi Zechariah? Proper humility means having the right relationship to self, giving yourself neither too big nor too small a role in your life. By having the right relationship with yourself, you could have a healthier relationship with others, especially those closest to you. In conclusion, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, who was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel, said it well. Humility is associated with spiritual perfection. When humility affects depression, it's defective. When it's genuine, it inspires joy, courage, and inner dignity. The goal for all of us, the rabbis would teach us, is to say when we pass from this world, he or she was so humble, they didn't even know they were humble. And I love this story. It's told of a king who decided to be humble and modest. So when his horses and carriage were prepared for him to go for a ride, he ordered that the empty carriage be sent ahead while he would walk behind the carriage. A wise man present told him, "My king, that's not humility, because the truly humble man does not publicize his humility. Instead, he's humble while riding in the carriage." The Baal Shem Tov would teach us, true humility is not what one displays on the outside, but one feels in his heart. If we are a leader of our families, our office, our community, our congregation, are we expressing the true amount of humility? Are we filling our space? Are we making decisions knowing that we have the opportunity to make change because our community or our families or our colleagues have given us that opportunity? The rabbis are warning us through this story. Take the proper amount of space. Fulfill your obligations. Use your God-given talents to do what your space will allow you to do. And by doing so, we can all make proper change. Chag Sameach, everyone. Thanks.
Pirkei Avot says, Aseh lecha Rav, find yourself a teacher. I think Houston is indeed very blessed. Houston has a group of rabbis, a group of leaders who have the ability to guide us and to teach us, to help us live our lives. May it be God's will that we continue to come together as a community, study together, celebrate together, and if I may paraphrase at this point, let them eat blintzes. Please come on back and join us for some food.
those Shavuos. What is it? That's the eternal, that's the yahrzeit board. So that's the, yeah, that's all, Dad's on ours at Beth Yeshurun, right? You remember that? Yeah, that's what it looks like at my grandparents' synagogue too.